Gen X does not fear reality. Reality fears Gen X. Most people today live trapped in anxiety, overthinking, identity confusion, and endless psychological noise. They feel controlled by uncertainty, controlled by future outcomes, controlled by invisible expectations. But Gen X developed a radically different mental architecture that prevents fear from taking over their consciousness. This video draws from Jungian psychology, Stoic philosophy, and cognitive neuroscience, revealing a hidden psychological framework that Gen X unconsciously built through cultural pressure, existential exposure, and symbolic self-reliance. In the next few minutes, you will understand why Gen X thinks in a fundamentally different way, how their brain structure evolved under silent pressures, and how you can adopt this mental framework to dissolve fear and gain inner sovereignty. Gen X was born into a world that offered few guarantees and even fewer psychological safety nets. Their childhoods unfolded in a space between analog reality and the burgeoning digital frontier, in a time when society itself was undergoing quiet but profound transformations. Unlike generations that followed, they were not endlessly shielded from discomfort, nor were they immersed in environments meticulously curated to maintain a constant sense of emotional stability. They were, in many ways, left to navigate life with minimal scaffolding, and in this absence, something extraordinary happened. A unique mental framework began to form. This generation was the first to straddle two very different eras. They witnessed, in real time, the tension between old-world stability and the dawn of an entirely new technological consciousness. Televisions flickered with Cold War anxieties, newspapers carried warnings of nuclear threats, parents wrestled with economic uncertainty, and yet there was also the promise of innovation, music, and cultural revolutions. These conflicting signals created a subtle psychological paradox. The world was simultaneously fragile and resilient, threatening and full of opportunity. From this tension, Gen X learned, often unconsciously, to anchor themselves internally rather than rely on external validation. Many Gen X children grew up in households where parents were overworked, distracted, or emotionally distant. Not maliciously, but because the circumstances demanded it. Unlike the later generations, who often experienced structured emotional guidance, constant reinforcement, and social media mirrors reflecting every choice and feeling, Gen X faced a reality in which they had to interpret and manage their own emotional landscape. They learned early that the world would not always pause to reassure them, that mistakes were real and consequences immediate, and that resilience was not optional but necessary. In this crucible, self-reliance was forged, not as a philosophical ideal, but as a practical survival strategy. This upbringing instilled in them an inherent independence of thought. While other generations might rely heavily on social approval to define identity or establish worth, Gen X learned to navigate life with a subtler compass. Their moral and psychological navigation systems were often calibrated through observation, reflection, and trial-and-error experience, rather than guided instruction. They saw the fragility of authority figures and the imperfection of systems, and they understood that true stability could only emerge from within. This is why, even in chaotic circumstances, Gen X exhibits an unusual calm, a groundedness that stems from long exposure to uncertainty and the internalization of responsibility. Another factor contributing to their unique mindset was the lack of pervasive technological distraction. Gen X grew up in a world without smartphones, social media, or the constant surveillance of peer approval. Their minds were trained to sustain attention for longer periods, to reflect deeply on problems, and to navigate uncertainty without immediate external feedback. This slower rhythm of thought cultivated an extraordinary mental resilience. Fear, which often arises from fragmented attention and hypersensitivity to stimuli, found little fertile ground in minds trained to observe, analyze, and integrate experience over time. Culturally, they were exposed to a subtle existential education. They witnessed social upheavals, shifts in family structures, economic recessions, and political unrest. Not as abstract news cycles, but as real, lived experiences that shaped their formative years. This constant brush with instability taught them that life does not guarantee comfort, that chaos is inevitable, and that survival and growth depend on an internal equilibrium rather than external assurances. In mystical terms, one could say they were initiated into the reality of impermanence and uncertainty before the concept even entered philosophical discourse in popular culture. Through all of this, Gen X developed a kind of quiet courage that does not announce itself. They are not fearless in the sense of lacking vulnerability or emotion. They are fearless because their inner systems were calibrated in adversity. Their minds became like finely tuned instruments, capable of perceiving reality with clarity and responding to challenges without the paralytic overlay of fear that afflicts those accustomed to constant protection and validation. In essence, their psychological architecture was built by necessity. Resilience became instinctive, independence became habitual, and a kind of existential pragmatism became second nature. They learned to observe the world without being enslaved to its narratives, to tolerate discomfort without retreating, and to trust in their own capacity to navigate the unknown. Unlike generations that grew up with the expectation of constant reassurance, Gen X internalized the truth that life itself is the ultimate teacher, and that security, wisdom, and confidence are cultivated internally, not externally. What emerges from all this is a mind that functions differently on a fundamental level. It is a mind less prone to fear-driven reactions, less dependent on social affirmation, and more capable of perceiving life with both detachment and engagement simultaneously. They operate as if they have learned a silent internal method of orientation in the chaos of existence, a method that allows them to move through life with a quiet mastery that often appears mystical to outsiders, though it is the product of lived experience, reflection, and the subtle shaping forces of an environment that offered no easy comforts. In the end, what defines Gen X is not rebellion for its own sake, nor cynicism, nor detachment from society. It is a profound and practical engagement with reality as it is, unmediated by illusions of perpetual safety. They learn to trust themselves when the world provided no guarantees, to find stability within instability, and to cultivate a form of inner sovereignty that continues to distinguish them from generations that followed. Theirs is a consciousness shaped in silence, observation, and trial, one that offers lessons not only for understanding their mindset, but for anyone seeking to cultivate fearlessness, clarity, and self-directed purpose in a world increasingly dominated by distraction, uncertainty, and artificial validation. Gen X exhibits a calm mind in a way that seems almost unnatural to other generations, yet the secret behind this composure is subtle, hidden in patterns few notice. It is not that they lack fear. Fear exists as it exists for all humans, but it operates differently in them, almost as if it is a tool rather than a tyrant. To understand this, we must look beyond surface behavior and explore the underlying architecture of perception that life, circumstance, and culture instilled in them. From the very beginning, Gen X experienced instability as a constant. The external world was unreliable. Economic recessions, shifting social norms, parental stress, and global uncertainty were not anomalies. They were the expected backdrop of daily life. Yet, paradoxically, this constant exposure to unpredictability created stability inside. While most humans become fragile when confronted with repeated uncertainty, Gen X learned the silent alchemy of turning chaos into internal structure. This is counterintuitive. Adversity, instead of breaking them, forged a resilience that becomes visible only when you look closely at their mental patterns. They developed what could be called a psychological immune system. Just as repeated low-level stress trains the body to resist disease, the mind adapts to emotional and existential stressors. Gen X did not have the luxury of avoidance or constant reassurance. They could not outsource their emotional stability to social media validation or parental affirmation. They learned, often unconsciously, that the only true foundation for equilibrium was internal. Over time, this internal scaffolding became second nature. Fear could still arise, but it no longer hijacked the mind. Instead, fear became data, a signal to process rather than a force to react to. Another hidden pattern lies in how they interpret cause and effect. While other generations are conditioned to respond impulsively to immediate stimuli, Gen X developed a more linear, systemic approach. They learned to observe events, analyze patterns, and act deliberately rather than reflexively. This is not mere caution, it is a cognitive strategy honed through lived experience. In effect, they turned uncertainty into information. Every threat, every disruption, every social ambiguity became a lesson in adaptation rather than a trigger for panic. Even their relationship with social perception differs. Where many humans anchor identity in constant feedback loops, likes, comments, peer approval, Gen X had far fewer mirrors reflecting their choices. This scarcity, rather than creating insecurity, trained an inner locus of identity. Their self-concept emerged less from what others thought, and more from what they knew to be true about themselves. This subtle divergence has profound implications. It frees the mind from the paralyzing grip of imagined judgments, enabling them to move through fear-inducing situations with a composure that others struggle to maintain. The pattern extends to their cognitive rhythms as well. Growing up in an environment without pervasive digital distraction, their attention developed a capacity for depth, for sustained observation, and for subtle integration of complex information. Fear often amplifies in fragmented attention where stimuli are scattered and unresolved. In contrast, Gen X's mental habits encourage cohesion, a continuous thread of thought that absorbs, processes, and integrates experience without succumbing to reactive loops. Their calm is not passive, it is active, structured, and deliberate. What is remarkable and easy to miss is the subtlety of this adaptation. It does not announce itself with grandiose gestures or dramatic displays. Instead, it manifests in a quiet, enduring confidence. The ability to tolerate discomfort without overreacting, to make decisions under pressure without panic, and to navigate uncertainty as a familiar terrain. To the untrained eye, it may appear as detachment or even indifference, but it is in fact an intricate mastery of the mind's internal architecture. Perhaps the most unexpected dimension of this pattern is how it intersects with temporal perception. Gen X tends to operate in longer arcs, seeing life in years, decades, and generational cycles, rather than in momentary outcomes or ephemeral trends. This expanded temporal lens allows them to contextualize fear within a broader continuum, diluting the immediacy that typically triggers anxiety. Where most people are trapped in a present-centered feedback loop, reacting impulsively to short-term threats, Gen X can mentally step back, observe, and respond from a space of temporal awareness. This is the hidden tension that makes their calm so powerful. It is not a lack of awareness, nor a lack of feeling. It is an internalized mastery of observation, integration, and temporal depth. Their minds are both deeply attuned and selectively detached, capable of perceiving threats, understanding patterns, and yet remaining unpossessed by the immediate emotional upheaval that dominates less structured consciousness. To fully appreciate this pattern, one must see it as a form of internal alchemy. Fear, instead of being a master, becomes raw material. It is transmuted into clarity, strategic thinking, and resilience. In this way, Gen X learned, without formal instruction, what mystics call sovereignty of consciousness, the ability to observe reality fully without being consumed by it. Fear is present, but it is a tool, not a dictator. The mind does not dissolve it magically. It reframes it systematically, perceives it as information, and integrates it into decision-making. This hidden structure explains why Gen X often seems to navigate crises with a stability that defies explanation. It is not luck, nor innate temperament. It is the outcome of prolonged, repeated exposure to uncertainty, scarcity, and complexity. Conditions that, paradoxically, built a mind uniquely resistant to fear's typical grip. The pattern is subtle, often invisible, yet it defines a generation's psychological landscape. A calm born not of avoidance, but of deliberate internal calibration in response to the chaos of life. In the next chapter, we will explore the deeper mechanics of this psychological architecture, the internal narrative structures and cognitive systems that allow fear to function as a tool rather than a tyrant, revealing a profound truth about human consciousness and the way reality is perceived, structured, and ultimately mastered. Gen X does not merely react differently to fear, they inhabit a fundamentally different relationship with reality itself. Fear, at its essence, is a story the mind tells about potential harm, loss, or failure. It is a loop, a predictive narrative that projects possible futures onto the present, and in most minds this narrative runs unchecked, shaping perception, behavior, and even identity. The extraordinary insight about Gen X is that through exposure, culture, and circumstance, they did not allow fear to dictate the narrative of their lives. Instead, they restructured the story internally, creating a mental framework in which fear becomes a signal rather than a tyrant. To understand this, we must step back and consider the architecture of human consciousness. The mind does not experience reality directly. It filters existence through perception, memory, expectation, and internal narrative. Fear thrives in this filtered space, exploiting the gaps between what is and what is imagined. Most humans, particularly in later generations, live in a constant projection of potential failure, social judgment, or existential threat. These projections, reinforced by social media, cultural expectation, and overvalidation, create a feedback loop where fear is amplified and sustained. Gen X, however, grew up with fewer artificial reinforcements. They experienced life more directly, in analog terms. Mistakes had real consequences, validation was scarce, and uncertainty was normal. Over time, this forced a cognitive recalibration. They learned to perceive reality without the heavy overlay of fear-driven projection. Their minds developed structural resilience, a capacity to integrate experience fully without allowing predictive narratives to dominate consciousness. Fear, in their system, became informational, an alert to consider, analyze, and respond, rather than a paralyzing force. This psychological architecture rests on several interwoven principles. First, there is agency. Gen X learned early that outcomes depended primarily on their actions rather than external rescue. They could not rely on constant supervision, guidance, or social scaffolding. This internalized locus of control reorients the mind fundamentally. When the self is the primary agent, fear loses authority because the mind recognizes that action is possible no matter the circumstance. Fear becomes a signal to act, not a force to obey. Second, there is self-authorship. Identity for Gen X emerged internally, rather than being endlessly reflected back by social mirrors. Jung described the process of individuation as the cultivation of a coherent self, independent of collective projection. Gen X, through circumstance, underwent this process organically. Their sense of self is less susceptible to the projections of peers, culture, or social media. With a self-authored identity, fear is deprived of one of its greatest weapons, the imagined judgment of others. Third, there is cognitive cohesion. Unlike generations constantly fragmented by algorithmic distraction, Gen X developed sustained attention and integrated thinking. Their minds could hold complexity, observe patterns, and process reality in its full nuance. Fragmented cognition is fertile ground for fear, which thrives on ambiguity and discontinuity. In a cohesive mind, fear is contained. It can be examined, understood, and used strategically rather than becoming overwhelming. Fourth, there is temporal depth. Gen X tends to think in long arcs, years, decades, entire life trajectories, rather than in immediate gratification or short-term consequences. Fear often dominates when perception is confined to the immediate. A long-term perspective dilutes the intensity of fear by contextualizing it within broader temporal frameworks. A crisis that seems insurmountable in the moment is understood as one of many events in a continuous flow, reducing the grip of panic. Finally, there is existential integration. From cultural exposure to crises, global instability, and shifting social norms, Gen X internalized the inevitability of uncertainty. They came to understand, consciously or unconsciously, that reality is inherently unpredictable. Fear, when it emerges in a mind conditioned to accept uncertainty as structural, no longer triggers paralysis. Instead, it becomes a tool for navigation. Uncertainty is no longer a threat, but a signal, a challenge, a space in which to exercise agency. When combined, these principles create a mental landscape where fear functions differently. In the typical human mind, fear dominates perception, restricting action and narrowing consciousness. In Gen X, fear becomes transparent. It is observed, analyzed, and transmuted. It can still exist, but it does not dictate the terms of experience. This is a kind of internal sovereignty, a mastery over the narrative structures that shape perception itself. Philosophically, this touches on an ancient truth. Freedom is not the absence of fear, but mastery over it. Mystics have long described this state as the ability to witness reality without attachment, to engage with existence fully without being consumed by projection, desire, or aversion. Stoics called it the inner citadel, the mind's impenetrable sanctuary. In Gen X, we see a naturalized version of this principle, emerging not from meditation or doctrine, but from lived experience, challenge, and necessity. In practical terms, this insight reveals a roadmap for the mind. Fear is not the enemy to be eradicated, it is a signal to be understood and integrated. By cultivating agency, self-authorship, cognitive cohesion, temporal depth, and acceptance of uncertainty, anyone can begin to perceive fear as information rather than a dictator. Gen X demonstrates this architecture as a living example, a blueprint for consciousness that navigates existence without being ensnared by the illusions of threat. Ultimately, the core insight is this: the human mind can evolve its relationship to fear, and exposure to reality, properly integrated, is the catalyst. Gen X did not escape fear by avoiding it. They transformed their internal landscape so that fear serves their consciousness instead of controlling it. This is the profound psychological and philosophical secret that underlies their apparent fearlessness. You may have noticed it yourself. There are moments when the world feels overwhelming, when uncertainty, social pressure, or invisible expectations press against your mind like a weight you cannot lift. Anxiety creeps in silently, often disguised as small distractions, fleeting worries, or the relentless noise of comparison. You may feel trapped in loops of overthinking, chasing validation, or anticipating failure. And in those moments, it seems as though fear is not just an emotion, it is a force that dictates the rhythm of your life, shaping choices, reactions, even your sense of self. Now consider the contrast. Observe Gen X individuals, your parents, mentors, colleagues, or figures you've noticed in your life, and notice how differently they respond. They navigate stress, uncertainty, and high stakes without the same visible tremors of fear. They move with a calm intentionality, not because life has been easier for them, but because they have internalized a different psychological rhythm. Their minds have been structured to contain fear rather than be contained by it. This is not a matter of talent, luck, or privilege. It is the product of lived experience, reflective adaptation, and the shaping forces of circumstances that demanded resilience. And here is the most important point for you. This is not an unattainable ideal. You are not fundamentally trapped in fear. The mind is malleable. The same principles that shape Gen X agency, cognitive cohesion, temporal depth, self-authorship, and integration of uncertainty can be applied to your own consciousness. You may not have grown up with those exact conditions, but the architecture can be built intentionally. The insights are transferable. The difference lies not in your biology or destiny, but in the structure of attention, reflection, and self-understanding. Pause for a moment and reflect on your own life. Recall the moments when fear dictated your actions, when hesitation prevented opportunity, when self-doubt overshadowed your capacity to act, or when uncertainty seemed unbearable. Now imagine that same situation viewed through the lens of Gen X consciousness. The mind observes fear, analyzes its signals, contextualizes it in long arcs of time, and responds with deliberate action. Fear is no longer the master, it is a guide. The tension remains, but it is productive, informative, and contained. You might feel a subtle shift as you read this, a recognition that what has felt immutable is actually malleable. That is the personal connection. You are not only observing Gen X as a phenomenon in the world, you are recognizing the potential within yourself to adopt similar principles. This realization is deeply human. It is a reminder that the inner architecture of your mind is not fixed, that fear does not have to dominate, and that sovereignty of consciousness is available to anyone willing to structure their awareness. It is also a call to radical self-honesty. To cultivate this internal freedom, you must acknowledge how fear manifests in your own life. Not in vague terms, but specifically, which habits, patterns, or compulsions arise from fear? Which decisions, large or small, have been influenced by imagined outcomes rather than deliberate choice? Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward integration. Gen X did not ignore fear. They confronted it repeatedly in real, tangible ways and built their minds to withstand it. You can do the same. And there is another subtle dimension here: compassion. As you begin to observe your own fear with clarity, you may also notice that it arises from the same forces that shape most human minds: expectation, uncertainty, social pressure, and the illusion of control. Understanding this does not weaken your resolve. it strengthens it. It connects you to a larger pattern of human consciousness, showing that your struggle is neither unique nor permanent. It is simply a challenge that can be met with awareness, structure, and intention. In this way, the personal connection is both intimate and universal. It situates you in a lineage of human effort to master fear, not through avoidance or denial, but through structure, reflection, and integration. You are invited to witness your own mind, recognize the narratives that shape your perception, and begin to implement the internal practices that allow fear to function as a tool rather than a dictator. By seeing this, truly seeing it, you may feel a sense of liberation. A subtle shift occurs when fear is recognized as information rather than identity, when patterns are observed rather than blindly followed. You begin to perceive yourself as capable, intentional, and sovereign. You begin to feel what Gen X has, not because they are inherently different, but because they cultivated internal structures that allowed them to navigate life with clarity and calm. And you too can cultivate these structures. In essence, this chapter is not just about observing a generation. It is about reflecting on your own mind, acknowledging the ways fear has influenced your choices, and recognizing that transformation is possible. You are being seen in this reflection. You are being reminded that your consciousness can be trained, expanded, and refined. You are invited to step into a higher alignment with reality, to move through fear with clarity, and to cultivate the same sovereign mental architecture that allows Gen X to face life without being dominated by its uncertainties. It is time to step into the quiet inner work that transforms insight into lived experience. You have seen the patterns that shape Gen X, their ability to observe fear without being controlled by it, their mastery of internal narrative, their integration of uncertainty, and now you are invited to explore the same architecture within yourself. This is not a call to mimic, nor to compare, but to awaken the latent capacities of your own consciousness. Begin by observing yourself with radical clarity. Notice the moments when fear arises, when hesitation slows action, when self-doubt clouds perception. Observe these patterns without judgment, without shame. In this act of observation, you are creating a sacred space within your mind, a sanctuary where consciousness is sovereign. Here, fear is no longer a master, it is information, a signal to examine, interpret, and integrate. Next, cultivate agency intentionally. Consider the areas of your life where you habitually surrender to external narratives, where you defer to opinion, expectation, or circumstance. In each instance, ask yourself, what is within my control? What is mine to shape, to act upon, to influence? Begin practicing deliberate action in small ways, letting each decision reinforce the understanding that your mind can structure reality through choice. This is the foundation of sovereignty, a consciousness that operates from deliberate alignment rather than reactive chaos. Now, integrate uncertainty into your daily rhythm. Instead of resisting the unknown, approach it with curiosity and awareness. Recognize that life's unpredictability is not a threat but a natural dimension of existence. By internalizing this principle, you shift perception. Uncertainty becomes a teacher, not an enemy, a guide, not a tyrant. Each unpredictable moment is an opportunity to practice composure, reflection, and subtle mastery of your inner world. Another essential practice is deep temporal awareness. Train your perception to move beyond the immediacy of moment-to-moment fear. Step back and observe the long arcs of your life, the years, cycles, and evolving trajectories that contextualize each challenge. When you perceive life in its broader temporal context, fear loses its exaggerated weight. It becomes data rather than dictate. You begin to respond with perspective, groundedness, and deliberate clarity. Self-authorship is equally critical. Reflect on who you are beneath the influence of external expectations, social mirrors, and cultural scripts. Begin consciously constructing an identity that is grounded in your values, insights, and intentional choices. As you cultivate this self-authored identity, the mind naturally resists the manipulations of fear, social pressure, and reactive thinking. You are no longer defined by what is projected onto you. You are defined by the structures you build within. Finally, create spaces for reflection and integration. Silence is not emptiness. It is the medium through which insight crystallizes. Daily practices of meditation, journaling, or contemplative observation allow the mind to process experiences fully, transforming moments of fear into wisdom, uncertainty into clarity, and challenge into growth. These practices are the conduits through which the Gen X psychological architecture can be consciously adopted, refined, and personalized. This is not a sudden transformation. It is a gradual awakening, a patient cultivation of internal structures that make fear intelligible, manageable, and ultimately useful. Each small action reinforces the sovereignty of consciousness. Each reflective moment strengthens cognitive cohesion. Each deliberate choice rewires perception. Over time, the cumulative effect is profound. Fear no longer dominates, uncertainty is met with composure, and life becomes an active engagement rather than a reactive drift. You are being invited to an inward journey that parallels the lessons encoded in a generation shaped by adversity. Observe, act, integrate, reflect. In doing so, you align with a hidden architecture of the mind that allows clarity to emerge in chaos, calm to emerge in uncertainty, and agency to emerge in situations once dominated by fear. This is the awakening. It is quiet, patient, and subtle, but immensely powerful. It is the process of reclaiming sovereignty over your consciousness, of stepping out of unconscious loops of fear, and of cultivating an inner landscape where perception, reflection, and action are harmonized. You are not imitating Gen X. You are translating their patterns into your own context, into a unique, sovereign mental architecture designed for the challenges of your life, your era, and your evolving consciousness. In this space, fear becomes a teacher, not a jailer. Uncertainty becomes an ally, not an adversary. Life itself becomes a laboratory for mastering the mind, perceiving reality clearly, and moving with intention rather than reaction. This is the inward practice, the mystical work, the philosophical path toward true inner freedom. Gen X did not become fearless by avoiding the storms of life. They walked through uncertainty, instability, and disruption until those very forces became familiar territory. They were not born with immunity to fear. They were forged in it, shaped quietly, patiently, and relentlessly. In the crucible of experience, they learned to merge with reality rather than resist it, to observe without surrendering to illusion, to act without being imprisoned by imagined threats. Their strength is not loud nor performative, nor celebrated. It is subtle, almost invisible. It emerges in the calmness of their decision-making, in the steadiness of their attention, in the quiet certainty that comes from living in alignment with internal structures rather than external validation. In a world obsessed with instant gratification, constant stimulation, and emotional amplification, their inner architecture looks almost mystical, almost uncanny. But it is not magic. It is lived experience, refined observation, and the deliberate cultivation of consciousness under conditions of unpredictability. What Gen X demonstrates is a fundamental truth about the human mind. Clarity, composure, and sovereignty are not gifts. They are cultivated. They are the natural outcome of repeated engagement with reality, of persistent reflection, and of integration of uncertainty. They are available to anyone willing to observe themselves, to question their habitual patterns, and to construct the internal frameworks that allow fear to serve rather than dominate. As you reflect on their example, consider the hidden invitation in their calm. It is an invitation for you to cultivate your own inner citadel, your own mental architecture, and your own capacity to perceive reality with clarity. Fear, when understood, becomes a teacher. Uncertainty becomes a guide. Chaos becomes a canvas upon which consciousness can practice mastery. This is the subtle power that Gen X demonstrates so effortlessly, yet it is replicable, accessible, and deeply human. In the end, the lesson is simple, yet profound. Life does not need to be tamed, but the mind can be trained. The storms of existence are inevitable, but the consciousness that observes them can remain unmoved. This is the quiet miracle that occurs when observation, reflection, and intentionality converge within the self. It is a path of sovereignty, a journey of integration, and a practice of awakening that transcends generations. As the world continues to accelerate, to fragment, and to amplify fear in countless forms, Gen X offers a model not just for survival, but for mastery. Their calm is a map, their composure a blueprint, their existence a living testament to what is possible when the mind learns to perceive without being enslaved by illusion. And so, as you step back from this reflection, carry with you the understanding that you too can cultivate this internal architecture. Begin to observe, integrate, and act. Allow fear to inform rather than dominate. Let uncertainty guide rather than confine. Stand in your own inner clarity and move through life with intention, presence, and quiet mastery. In this space, you do not merely survive, you awaken. You do not merely endure, you perceive. You do not merely exist, you participate consciously in the unfolding of reality, free from the tyranny of unexamined fear. And in that awakening, you touch the essence of what it means to move through life as a sovereign mind, a conscious observer, and a participant in the mystery of existence itself. The path is subtle, the work is quiet, but the transformation is profound. Fear is no longer a master, uncertainty is no longer a cage, and life becomes not a series of reactive moments, but a deliberate, conscious, and unfolding expression of your inner sovereignty.